Professor P.N. Prakash, നമ്മുടെ വിശിഷ്ടതിയായിട്ടുള്ള സച്ചിദാനന്ദ മാഷ്, ദാസ് മാഷ് എവിടെ പോയി? നമ്മൾ പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കുന്നത് പി വി കൃഷ്ണനായർ സാറെയാണ്. സാറ് വരുന്നത് പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കുന്നു. നമുക്ക് തുടങ്ങാം. കോമ്പയർ ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് ഗവൺമെന്റ് കോളേജ് ഓഫ് നെല്ലൂരിലെ അസിസ്റ്റന്റ് പ്രൊഫസറായിട്ട് സീനിയർ.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this special gathering organized by the Center for English Studies and Research, CESR. I extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests, respected faculty members, research scholars, students, and all those literature lovers who are gathered here today. Today is a particularly memorable occasion in the history of Center for English Studies and Research as we celebrate 20 years of its remarkable academic journey.
Respected President of today's function, distinguished Chief Guest, esteemed members of the organizing committee, learned colleagues, scholars, students, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm good evening to each and every one of you, and a hearty welcome to this house of letters to listen to an erudite scholar of letters to speak on this land of letters. It's my absolute honor and privilege to welcome you all this evening to a landmark milestone in the cultural and academic landscape of our city. Today, we gather here to celebrate the 20th anniversary of CESR, Center for English Studies and Research, Thrissur. For more than 2 decades, this institution has stood as a beacon of intellectual curiosity, research excellence, and critical dialogue, and it's a matter of immense joy to see this vibrant community come together to commemorate this journey. I extend a most hearty and respectful welcome to our chief guest, Professor Dr. K Satchidanandan sir. As an eminent poet, translator, critic, and social activist, your words have shaped and inspired generations. We are incredibly grateful to you for gracing this occasion to deliver the inaugural lecture on a theme that is both timely and profoundly engaging: Indian literature, singular or plural. Welcome to you, sir. Next, I would like to welcome the pillars of CESR, Center for English Studies and Research.
His sincerity of purpose, the way he was helping us to hold the meeting every month.
Professor Dr. K Satchidanandan is a poet, critic, translator, editor, and public intellectual whose work transcends linguistic and geographical boundaries. For several decades, he has remained an influential voice in Indian letters, engaging readers and scholars alike through his poetry, literary criticism, translations, and reflections on culture, society, and democracy. His writings have enriched literary discourse not only in Malayalam and English, but also across numerous Indian and world languages through translation. The theme of today's inaugural lecture, Indian literature, singular or plural, is especially significant in a multinational nation or multilingual nation like ours, where literary expression flourishes through a rich diversity of languages, traditions, and cultural experiences. There will be no more fitting speaker to guide us through this important conversation than K Satchidanandan, whose lifelong engagement with literature has consistently celebrated dialogue across languages and culture. It is indeed a matter of great honor and privilege for the Center for English Studies and Research to welcome him to inaugurate the 20th anniversary celebrations and deliver the inaugural lecture. May I now respectfully invite Professor to the dais and request him to inaugurate the program and address the gathering. Professor?
Dear Professor B.N. Prakash, Dr. Prakash, who welcome the gathering in earnest warmth, P.V. Krishnan, who is soon to be here, I understand, and Dr. K Nandakumar, who is already here, and Professor I. Shanmugadas, who happens to be the coordinator of CESR, Center for English Studies and Research, of which I began to hear quite a few years ago when this organization had just begun. It was the beginning of the mission of this organization, where research was being done, lectures being delivered, and interactions promoted. I'm excited here, if an 80-year-old man can be excited at all, to be inaugurating or to be giving this inaugural lecture on Indian literature, singular or plural. Excited because it happens to be the 20th anniversary of this well-intended, well-organized cultural and literary association. Let me at the beginning, before I forget it, inaugurate this series of lectures which is going to follow throughout the year, as I understand, not only lectures but readings of excerpts from maybe samples of world literature, readings of poetry, and various kinds of activities which have something to do with the research and the studies that you seem to have been pursuing and still seem to be pursuing. So I first of all welcome all of you. I can see translators and poets there, and I'm sure you are all very great, passionate readers of literature, and it's always a pleasure to be talking to such people. Even though it embarrasses me a little that as a Malayali I shall be speaking to Malayalis in English outside the classroom. Inside the classroom, well, okay, I've been teaching English all through 30 years and then 2 or 3 years in Delhi. But to have a Malayali audience and to be speaking in English, I don't know whether to call it colonial or post-colonial, really. So maybe it's a post-colonial situation where a language has been happily imposed on you. Because we were on the way, we were talking about the multilingual nature of India as a country and Indian literature as a body of great works. Then someone spoke of, who was with me, spoke of, remember Nicanor, Bertolt Brecht and quite a few others, and some of the poems. Then we spoke of Spanish in Spain and Spanish in Latin America. Then we also began to speak of the several languages in India, because it is ultimately a polyphonic country, not only in the basic literal sense because it speaks so many languages, but also because it has several regional cultures, several ways of communication, and several forms of art, both indigenous and sometimes coming from outside India. Then we also spoke of English. We had to, because in some countries, especially called by the French and many of the Europeans, their own tongues completely disappeared and they all became English speakers. Perhaps you know it has happened to at least one part of India, not entirely to, the northeast. Most of the northeast people use mostly English, even though they do speak in their own mother tongues in their families. But in India, fortunately, they couldn't eradicate all the languages that we had, languages which have a very long history from 2000 years to 800 years. looking at the range of the languages that we have. So when the British came, and when they found that they couldn't abolish or eradicate or ban all the languages of India, they decided against it, and they thought, okay, instead we will contribute one more language to this polyphony, to this multitude of languages which already exist in India. And that's exactly what happened. We got one more language to speak in, to write in, to communicate, and to do research in. And that is precisely the space where an association like this, Center for English Studies and Research, is placed and continues to work. I had also to speak about Indian literature, speaking about which is perhaps the most challenging task for any Indian, even if a scholar, because we have Indian literature, means literature written in several languages, including English. As I said, it means literature which has produced its own genres. Every language has its own specific forms, besides the common forms, many of which, as we again know, came from Britain. Because Britain not only gave us some languages, it gave us fiction. Of course we had, not that we did not have any novel before the British came, we had some, but then novel became a kind of popular one after it reached India, after the British came. And then we had short story, then we had lyrics, then we had sonnets, we had essays, we had all kinds of different forms of poetry and fiction and various kinds of literature after the British came. So while we curse the British for all that they did to us, because the first feeling I had when I visited the British Museum was anger rather than excitement, because I found the finest statues made in India kept in the British Museum. They have a particular floor below the normal level to keep all these stolen things for which entry was allowed to my family for certain reasons, and because of some of the friendships there. There you could see so many Natarajas and so many goddesses, and all kinds of statues, pieces of sculpture, both made in stone and in metal, gathered together. So they had stolen so many things from us. But we forget all that, and we remember that they also gave us this language. May not be beautiful, I'm not sure. Maybe some of the Indian languages are even more beautiful, especially to listen to. I don't think English is a very musical language, like Italian, for example, is. But it is semantically rich. It has a kind of rich, every word has so many synonyms, and you have so many ways of saying things, articulating things, expressing things, and that way English is certainly one of the richest languages of India. I am not saying what I plan to say, but of course I will come to that. It just comes to me when I look at all of you. And so English, but remember one thing again, that English itself is a multilingual language. Even though it may look like a paradox, we have only 10% of Anglo-Saxon words in English. 90% of English words have come from all over the world. Just look at the dictionary with some etymological details and you will see So many words have come from Latin, some have come from Greek, from French, from German, even from Sanskrit and some of the other Indian languages. Open the Oxford Dictionary, open the page where M begins and you will see Maya, which is not, as we very well know, an English word, not an English concept either. It's a totally Indian kind of concept. So you will come across so many words which belong to different languages. So they not only enrich the British Museum by bringing in things from across the world, from the countries they had colonized, but they also enriched the English dictionary or the English language or the English vocabulary by taking in so many words from different kinds of languages and sometimes giving them fresh meanings, fresh underpinnings, fresh suggestions. So English has that way helped us make ourselves more expressive, make ourselves in a way enabled us by linking our country with other countries, our culture with other cultures, our people with other peoples. And so we are able to travel across the world. You will find at least a few people who know English, though I found it very hard in France, to be frank. I was looking for the way. I had once been, Vishwanathan, Paris Vishwanathan, who is one of the well-known artists of the world. He's a Malayali. Well, he lives in one part of Paris and he had given me an explanation. That was not at times when you had Google Maps. So I took a metro, I landed at the precise station and then began to ask the people for a particular road where Vishwanathan had his house. But nobody would answer me in English. I even wrote it on a piece of paper and asked them, do you know the way? No. For two reasons. One is that there is a kind of an age-old rivalry between the British and the French. We have all learned in school about the wars between the British and the French. But more than that, I later found the French find English grammar very strange and very difficult. And as far as possible, they avoid speaking in English because of the fear that they might perhaps go wrong. Somewhere, in number or gender, or somewhere they may go wrong. And so they prefer to speak in French, if at all there is a possibility of speaking in French. And this is true about some parts of the world, including Europe. But in most of the parts of the world, you will find some people on the road or in the shops who will answer your English question in English itself. And so that's why I said English, even in that way, enrich our lives because you can travel the whole world without much fear of language. There are all kinds of fears around us, and the fear of language is one. And I am afraid the fear of the mother tongue is also going to become one soon. Looking at the way India is progressing, if you can use the word progress at all, for that kind of movement away from the mother tongues, away from the mother cultures, and moving from the present to the past. Even though we have all learned in grammar that from the present we move on to the future. But we in India seem to be moving to the past, to an imagined golden age in the past, where Manusmriti is the constitution and Vedas have all the truths inside. I have not attempted for Vedas or Upanishads because I read most of them when I was 21, 23, and my early poems are very much inspired and illuminated, especially by the Upanishads. I still remember many of the slogas of the Upanishads, like K Upanishad. So, if I go on talking like this, maybe it may become a little scattered and without a precise kind of defined subject. So I will unconsciously take you to the subject which has been offered to me, or rather the subject which I have offered to the organizers, Indian literature, singular or plural, or one or many. And when Murudas asked me for a Malayalam translation, I gave him a very typical Indian translation. Egam Anegam, Indian Sahityam, Egam Anegam, or Egamo Anegamo. Is it singular or is it plural? Well, this is a question that has been discussed for several years. Do we have a united, perhaps even uniform kind of Indian literature, or do we have several literatures in India? It comes down to a simple question: should we use singular or plural when we speak about Indian literature? Remember, I was the editor of a bi-monthly journal of the Sahitya Academy in Delhi called Indian Literature. That exactly was what set me thinking. Do we call this journal Indian literature or Indian literatures? And I began to read more and more about this, the singularity and the plurality, and also debate within myself as to which number I should use for Indian literature. I then remembered a story. I often begin my talks with stories. A story which is told by K Satchidanandan, which I have quoted in many talks, but not perhaps so much in Kerala. Of course, you know of the great book 300 Ramayanas. There are more than 300. That I am not going into that. There are at least 800 Ramayanas in India, but that book says there are 300. And I'm sure you have read Ola Rachman's book on the South Asian Ramayanas, various kinds of South Asian Ramayanas, where she deals with a variety of the texts of Ramayana available either orally or in written or performed forms. So A.K. Ramanujan has a famous essay which most of you must have read in 300 Ramayanas, which is a story about Ramayana in a sense, and also a story from Ramayana in another sense. That would be a kind of proper, if I think rightly, introduction to what I have to say very soon. One day, when Rama was sitting on his throne in the palace in Ayodhya, a ring from his index finger fell down and it disappeared through a hole on the floor. It just vanished. He couldn't see it anywhere. It was something very dear to him, and he did not know how to retrieve that ring which had gone into perhaps some other world that even he didn't know about. And then he asked, who, you can imagine, Hanuman, to go and bring it back. Hanuman, not because Hanuman was his messenger, but Hanuman could become very small like a mosquito and very big like a giant or a huge tree or whatever bigger things you can imagine. So he had this special ability to change his shape. He was a shape shifter, to use a more contemporary kind of form. So Hanuman became very small and entered through that hole. He bent down, and then he found he had reached another world, what we call or nether world. It's also called Adalam. I am yet to find the precise distinction between Adalam and Padal. So he reached this nether world, and he went to the king of the nether world and said, I am Rama's messenger. And he knew Rama was well known across the worlds. And so his ring fell down, and it must have fallen here because I found it going down, and it can have reached only into the world. Then the king looked at him in admiration, in wonder, and in embarrassment, and brought to him a huge platter full of rings, a plate of rings. And he asked Hanuman, I have heard a lot about you. You are a faithful messenger and Rama's loyal servant. And I am sure you can certainly recognize Rama's ring. But he also added, these are all Rama's rings. There have been so many Ramas. And whenever one Rama is about to die, his ring on the index finger falls down, it comes here. And my guards have collected all those rings and put them all in a single huge platter. Hanuman was obviously surprised. Hanuman is not somebody who is easily surprised, but even he was surprised that there was a platter full of rings, and he is being asked to select one ring which belonged to his Ram. He said, I am sorry, I am not able to recognize my Rama's ring. Then the king of the netherworld told him, well, I knew you wouldn't be able to. But you should know one more thing, that generally Rama's ring falls down and falls into the netherworld when that particular Ram or that particular avatar or incarnation of Ram is about to die. So by the time you go back and reach the earth, your Ram must have ended his sojourn on earth and left the earth. So be prepared for that too. In fear, in pain, Hanuman left, reached the earth, and found that Rama had already entered the Sarayu river and attained moksha, as people say, or attained salvation. In short, he was not there, and you can call it as a speak about death in many ways. You can speak about death as going to heaven, going to the netherworld, disappearing, vanishing, no more existing, all kinds of things. Anyway, Rama was no more there, and then Hanuman remembered what the king of the netherworld had said. Yes, my Ram is not there now. So I will have to do without Ram for the rest of my life. And how can I live without a master? So more than a story, this is only the piece of a story. But this piece of a story tells you so many pieces of stories about various Ramayanas that have existed on earth and that are even now perhaps being written somewhere in some part of the world. It is often believed that Ramayana belongs to the Indian tradition, but not entirely. It is there in Indonesia. Go to Malaysia, go to Singapore, and you will hear various versions of Ramayana all over. A poet who belonged to the Islamic religion from Malaysia write a poem about Sita in one of our international poetry festivals in Delhi. And I asked him, how come you write about Sita? You know about Ramayana? He said, of course, we have our Ramayana. And that is why Polarich man richly called it a South Asian tradition. It is not purely an Indian tradition, the tradition across South Asia, and there are Ramayanas across the whole of at least a good part of the continent of Asia. So Ramayana tells this story to tell us about thousands of Ramayanas which exist, at least hundreds of Ramayanas which exist across South Asia. The story of those rings tell us also a parallel story about the owners of those rings. Many Ramas who came and went, who lived for a while and did all kinds of wonderful, chivalrous, miraculous things and then disappeared. And so it should tell us about 300 or more Ramayanas that A.K. Ramanujan tells us this story as a kind of short introduction to what he has to say. So I began with Ramayana not because it's the time when Ramayana is being celebrated and Rama is being built, for him so many new temples are being built, but because somehow it has become a part of our poetic or epic tradition, like Mahabharata itself. And Ramayana can be interpreted in various ways, as you very well know. Sarah Joseph has written a series of stories on Ramayana. I have written a long study of it. I called it Sarayanangal, when the various Ramayanas as interpreted by Sarah Joseph in a different, very often contradictory way. And so there are so many others in Kerala and outside Kerala have written many novels and poems based on the basic story of Ramayana. But as I said, the Ramayana is not a single text, but actually a conglomeration of various kinds of texts that exist across South Asia. My memory is a little weak, so I will be depending on some notes. I am not reading them. I will depend sometimes on some notes to speak about not only various Ramayanas, from that to go to the various kinds of literatures which belong to different languages that we have lived with and we are going to live with, fortunately. So from A.K. Ramanujan's story and A.K. Ramanujan's essay on Ramayana, we can travel to different languages and look at completely different kinds of Ramayana which existed in those languages. So, what is common? I have tried to understand. I have read Polar's book, and also other books of Ramayana. And of course, you know, Father Kamil Bulki is available in Malayalam. I'm sure you have read it. His book on Ramayana, Father Kamil Bulki, is translated into Malayalam. He is a great student of Ramayana, and Father Kamil Bulki has also written about various kinds of Ramayanas. And all of them who have written about Ramayana have tried to find out what is common to all these Ramayanas. And they have found some things. One is, all these Ramayanas have Dasharatha, the king, Rama's father. All the Ramayanas have Ravana as his enemy, even though Ravana's birth is interpreted in various ways in different kinds of Ramayanas. And there is, of course, Sita, without whom Rama cannot be, even though we often say that without Sita, Rama cannot be, but perhaps that is not the way we should say. So without Sita, there cannot be a Rama. And then there are the three wives of Dasharatha, and then you have also the children, Rama, Lakshmana, Bharata, and Shukrana. These are the common factors in all the Ramayanas. Because there are even Ramayanas where there is no war at all between Rama and Ravana. That is how when I traveled to Gujarat, I spent some time with the Bhili tribe there. I went there to look at the beautiful wall paintings made by the Bhilis. Because they have, like the Santalis, they have also a great tradition of wall painting. which is not realistic but very stylized and symbolic and all that, and using colors in an unusual and superhuman way. I went to look at them, but I had also a conversation with some of the leaders of the Bili tribe. I did not know the Bili language, nor the Gujarati language. So I had Ganesh Devi, whom all of you know, of course. Actually, come to you? Yeah, you must have. Yeah. So Ganesh, GM Devi was with me, and he knew Gujarati, he knew some Bili too, so he could interpret for me. And then they told me that in our Ramayana, there is no war between Rama and Ravana. When Ravana realizes his mistake, because he fell in love with Sita, she was absolutely fantastically beautiful. No man could but fall in love with Sita. So he carried her, it is true. But when he realized it was a mistake, and Rama said, I am going to fight you and retrieve my Sita, then Ravana told him, no, there is no need for a war between us. I will give back Sita to you. She belongs to you more than to me. I have stolen her, which was a mistake. And they shake hands, they don't shake hands because there was no system in the Hindi culture, but practically they come to terms with each other and there is no war. Sita is just given back to Rama and their Ramayana ends. So I am just giving you some examples of this Ramayana. I don't, of course, because the lecture I know is not on Ramayana, but then this diversity of Ramayana shows you that Indian literature itself is so diverse. If one text can have so many versions, how can there be a single text in many languages? So we have several languages, several literatures, and all of them together we conveniently call Indian literature, but a term that is rather dubious and quite questionable. In certain Ramayanas, again, in Telugu folk Ramayana, Sita happens to be the daughter of Ravana. Ravana's name is Ravula, and Ravula, it's in a folk form. They sing it across several nights. And this Ravula has a daughter called Sita. So it becomes a kind of Oedipal relationship. And so it becomes sinful, and that's precisely what happens in one of the Telugu folk Ramayanas. And then again, in another folk Ramayana in Telugu, there is also a sister for Ram, which you don't find in Valmiki Ramayana or Reputed Ramayana. There is a sister called Shanta. So there are so many kinds of differences from one Ramayana to another. There is a Jain Ramayana. It is written by Vimala Suri. It is called Paumacharya, which is Padmacharita. That's the Pali version of Padmacharita. So in Paumacharya, because Jains, as you know, are non-violent, and Rama is supposed to be a Jain in that Ramayana, so Rama cannot fight Ravana. So he asked his brother Lakshman to go and fight Ravan and defeat him in a battle. And in the Buddhist Ramayana, which is called the Dasharatha Jataka, because I say this because we generally say it's a Hindu text. No, it is neither a Hindu text nor an Indian text alone. It has so many versions in different kinds of religions. Even in Malayalam we have a Mapada Ramayana. Remember that. So we have in these different versions, different contexts, episodes explained in different ways, and characters presented in a variety of ways. In the Dasharatha Jataka, I hope you know, in the Buddhist tradition, there are so many Jatakas. Jataka, in some sense, it means a kind of biography. we use Jataka in the meaning with the meaning in horoscope, but in the Buddhist tradition, Jataka means the story of a man. In some sense, our Jataka, the meaning of that Jataka is also somewhat similar because it is supposed to be the story of a particular person. So there is a Dasharatha Jataka, a story of Dasharatha, and in that particular kind of tradition again, there is non-violence, and all the characters ultimately go, they become Buddhists. In all the other characters, Rama is already a follower of Buddha, and other characters also become Buddhist, and it ends again like the Giri Ramayana in a kind of non-violent resolution to this impossible situation. So that again is another form of Ramayana. And in Malayalam itself, there are at least 37 Ramayanas and 370 or so plays and performances, various forms of Atthakathas and Vatandullals and paintings based on Ramayana. So among those Ramayanas, one or two have particularly fascinated me. What is Patala Ramayana? In Patala Ramayana, there is a Patala Ravan. And this Patala Ravan, who is the king of Patala, the king of the netherworld, he takes away Ram and Lakshman when they are trying to have a battle with Ravana. They are fighting Ravana, but his Patala Ravan comes up and he just steals, like Ravan stole Sita, steals these great warriors, great fighters, and takes both of them into the netherworld. And then Hanuman has to go, again Hanuman has to go to the netherworld, fight with the Patala Ravana and retreat, take back these brothers, Rama and Lakshman, and then they continue the battle. So there is another imagined character called Patala Ravana in Patala Ramayana. And about the Giri Ramayana, I have already said. And then in another Giri Ramayana, again tribal Ramayana, Ravana's soul enters a bee, and then you find Hanuman just throwing that bee into boiling water and killing him. Very easy. No blood. It is not like a great battle between two armies of Rama and Ravana, but Ravana, because Ravana has become, he has entered in order to escape Rama. He becomes a bee and he enters his soul enters the bee, and then he is the bee is just thrown into hot water and the bee is killed. And that happens in another Ramayana. And in Malayalam, you have Ashan's Chinda Vishnaya and Sita, about which we have had so many discussions in the recent years. Sita thinking a little about what Ram did to her, how she was banished into the forest, how that fate came to be in spite of marrying a supposedly good person like Ram. So Sarah Joseph also does something similar to the characters of Ramayana, and she retells Ramayana from a somewhat feminist point of view. So there are so many tellings and retellings and retellings of Ramayana across South Asia. I spoke only about a few of them, and I am not entering Mahabharata because that will be another lecture. Mahabharata has even more versions than Ramayana has. So I'm not going there at all. Instead, let me with this introduction, I was using Ramayana as a kind of metaphor. You must have understood by now. A metaphor to Indian literature, to present Indian literature and the variety of Indian literature. Because if one text can have so many versions, you can imagine so many texts in so many languages cannot be confined to, or a single body, or a single body or single corpus of literature. So, coming to, I have already come to the topic. I was just opening the gate, and I'm not, of course, the building is not going to be as big as you think. I have just opened the gate, and I should only say that there are three views about the plurality or the singularity of Indian literature. Is it single or plural? That question has been answered in three different kinds of ways. It was Niharanjan Ray, the British critic, the Bengali critic, who first said there cannot be an Indian literature at all because there is no language called Indian language. You have to, if you speak of Indian languages, you have to speak of all kinds of languages. About Tamil and Telugu and Kannada and Malayalam and Hindi and Rajasthani and so many, plus so many tribal languages and so many kinds of dialects that each language has. Hundreds of languages, not the 24 recognized by the constitution, but literally hundreds of languages. And so Niharanjan Ray said, if literature in India is written in so many languages, you cannot say, you cannot use the word Indian literature in singular. But K Satchidanandan, who was our president, Sarvepalli, S. Radhakrishnan, who was our president, said Indian literature is one, even though written in different languages. That is still the maxim of the Sahitya Akademi, what we call Kendra Sahitya Akademi, but what is generally known as Sahitya Akademi. That is, so Radhakrishnan statement that there is only one Indian literature. It is one literature written in so many languages. Of course, you are caught in a major debate around the dialectics of Indian literature. I myself was caught in that. It was then I happened to listen to a talk by Anantamurthy, who was also the president of the Sahitya Akademi when I was his secretary. Anantamurthy once said, if you listen to Anantamurthy, you know, suddenly insights come to him. It is not a prepared speech, suddenly he says new things. And in one talk, he somehow came to this topic, and he said, if you look for the diversity of Indian literature, you find the unity of Indian literature. If you look for the unity of Indian literature, you come across its infinite diversity. So this is something to think about. And this is something what I want you to leave to think about too. I want to leave you to think about. That is, there can be many literatures. So suppose you are looking for unity. What are the common elements that unite, say, Malayalam literature and Bengali literature? You will certainly find certain common elements, but you will also notice various kinds of differences in the way characters are formed, in the way the novel has evolved, in the way poetry has so many different kinds of forms. We don't have a Tagore, they have a Tagore, we have a Ramathod. So you will come across all kinds of differences between the two literatures when you look for the unity. Unity you will certainly find because there are so many common forms, in all Indian literatures. But you will also find a diversity when you look for the unity. And if you look for the diversity, how is Bengali literature different from Malayalam literature? If you look for that diversity, you will find so many common things. You may find, for example, the spirituality of Tagore in the poetry of Ray. For example, his own translator, Ishagar Group. So, similarly, so many, because we have all grown up reading Bengali novels, which Malayali hasn't grown up reading Bengali novels, and also translations of Russian novels and German novels and all that, Thomas Mann's transport heads. I remember reading in the school, and also all kind of Ashramokha Devi and Mahashara Devi and Tarasakar Banerjee and Venkateswara Chatterjee and all kind of guys. I can go on giving names. So we have grown up reading them, and we have also identified certain characters in all of them, which very much behave like Malayalis do, and who lead lives which are very close to the kind of lives that we live. So when we try to find the differences, we find there are so many things that connect these. But when we try to find the unity, we also find there are so many differences. Right from the dishes served on the table to the complexities of their the mental makeup, you find so many kinds of differences. So, to me, Anandamurti's dialectical statement is more approximate to truth than the statements made by either S. Radhakrishnan or Niharanjan Ray, because we have so many differences among the various literatures and literary works, but we have also certain things that seem to connect them. It is very important to remember this at this hour in our national life, because we are again speaking about a single literature, a single language, a single race, and all that. I am not going into that. I don't want to turn this into a political lecture at all, because they say it is in the land of Irelands, and we know from history, from Rabindranath onwards, from Nirvana onwards. If you have read Irelands, I am sure most of you have read Rabindranath's book of history called Irelands, where he clearly points out, and we have also books in Malayalam now based on that, that Aryans were the last people who came to India, and they were not Aryans by name, they only spoke Indo-Aryan languages. Sanskrit and related languages came to us, and they were the last. First came the people from Africa, they were our common ancestors, and then came people from Mediterranean regions and Central Asia, countries like Iran, and finally came the first were the tribal people, and to some part Dravidians, and then came the Central Asian people, and then came these people who speak Indo-Aryan languages, who some people came to call Aryans. Aryan, as you very well know, means only noble. So it's only just a kind of address, it is not the name of a particular race. Ethnographically, there is no Aryan. Anthropologically, there is no Aryan. There is no race called Aryan. There is only a language family called Aryan languages or Indo-Aryan languages, Sanskrit, and languages which are related to Sanskrit are generally called Indo-Aryan languages, and the languages of South India, and including some of the tribal languages, are most often called Dravidian languages. And if you just examine your DNA, because I happened to direct a literary festival in Calicut called Kerala Literary Festival. 1 year, we made an arrangement for DNA test. Anybody could go and test one's DNA, and everybody came back somewhat disappointed and said, "No, I am very impure. I am neither Aryan nor Dravidian, nor do I belong to the original African race. I have all of them in my blood." This is the truth. This beautiful impurity is the truth about Indian ethnicity. This beautiful, I call it consciously beautiful, because that is why we can be Indians. We inherit so many traditions. We can translate easily. We can understand many languages if we just try. And this diversity, racial diversity, also leads to linguistic diversity and other kinds of diversity. So we are not Aryans. There is no religion called the Hindu religion, because that was the name given to the Indians who originally lived here by the British and the people who came to India. They called all the Indians, they saw Hindus, while Hindus themselves were confused and divided. They had four varnas and so many jatis or castes and then sub-castes. You know, P.K. Balakrishnan saying in his book on the caste system that in India and in Kerala, Upajati or sub-caste is even more important than caste. So we have varnas and castes and sub-castes, and many were not considered Hindus at all. The Adivasis or the Dalits in the past were not considered Hindus at all. Now, of course, they are being converted into Hinduism and all that, but they were not considered Hindu. So, there is no single religion, an all-encompassing religion which can be called Hindu. There is no single race called Aryan, and Hindi again is the third lie. Because I have traveled across India, of course across the world, but then traveling across India I have come to find that when you go to a place, you ask them, what is the language you speak? You understand it a bit. You go to Bihar, for example, and a man from Bihar will say, sir, this is Bihari, that's what we speak. You go to Benares and you hear something like Hindi being spoken, and they say, sir, our language is, of course, Benarasi. It is not supposed. So, when we say that the whole of North India speaks Hindi, etc., we are not aware of the difference between one language and another language. And even languages which have very little to do with Hindi, like Rajasthani, are supposed to belong to the Hindi family, and Rajasthani is supposed to be one of the forms of Hindi language, which it is not at all. So, we have created three lives. And we have created a nation of lives around these three major lives. So we need to expose that. I said this in this particular context to say that to speak about a single Indian literature alone is not very different from saying India has only one language and one race. India has so many languages, and so India has so many literatures. Emphasizing this variety, I am not denying some of the underlying common factors at all. As Anthony said, there are certain things you may find in common, especially something about the complex Indian experience, something about the Indian subconscious. You may find certain common things, but ultimately, because we live, well, can I say fortunately, in a federal system, in fact our literature can also be approached only in a federal way. That is imagining an Indian literature, but actually finding only Malayalam literature and Tamil literature and Hindi literature and other kinds of literature. Because when you actually come to the day-to-day experience of an Indian, it is a Kerala experience, it is a Bengali experience, it is a Maharashtra experience. And so you can put them together in a basket and call it Indian, write a label on it, Indian. And that's what we do when we speak of an Indian literature also. It is true, it contains all kinds of literatures written in all kinds of languages. And because they all belong to a nation called India, which remember did not exist long ago. Even Kerala did not exist. If you, I want then said also to remember that even Kerala is a recent phenomenon. Because it would try to travel to Kochi and Malabar, which later united after a series of struggles for Kerala or United Kerala. So our present geographic boundaries were not necessarily the geographic boundaries of nations and states in the past. These are boundaries we have created, and these are boundaries which can easily change also. And that's why there are so many arguments about whether that belongs to China, this belongs to Sri Lanka, or this country, this part of Arunachal Pradesh belongs to India. Because we have drawn these lines, and then we begin fighting. Even Ravana could do without a fight, at least in one Ramayana, but we cannot do without a battle. So we go on creating reasons for war, and then we celebrate the victory of war. So we need to remember, whenever we speak about Indian literature, that it actually carries, as I said, you can take it as a kind of basket, but it carries so many different literatures written in different languages, carrying, novels and poems and all that, and carrying two different types of mindsets and written in different kinds of languages. So it is, we have to have if I can apply this word to literature at all, I am very afraid about it, federal concept of literature. Indian literature, if at all we need such a concept, it is a kind of federal concept where we put Malayalam literature and Tamil literature and maybe Rajasthani literature, Marathi literature all together and say this is Indian literature. But all these keep their individualities. Like Kerala has its own identity, its celebrations, its culture, its ways of living, its ways of camaraderie among the various religions and believers and non-believers and all that. So to emphasize that camaraderie, that friendship, that fraternity is important. While we also need to remember that Kerala's culture is not necessarily the culture even of Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh or Karnataka. And when you travel, you will be conscious of what they have different celebrations, they have different types of food and different ways of addressing one another. So it is in fact, in spite of all the connections and relationships, there is also this kind of difference. And to speak about that difference also becomes, I am not saying that alone becomes important, that also becomes important at a time when you speak only about a single India, a single language, a single race and all that stuff. So it is not that easy to identify one literature with another literature. So it is not easy to apply Advaita to Tamil literature and Malayalam literature and say there is no Advaita, there is no duality between Tamil and Malayalam. No, they have different stories of evolution. One language came later, one language came earlier, and there are so many forms in all these literatures which you may not get in other languages of India. So we need to realize this. Well, we need to realize this difference between one language and another, one culture and another, when we speak of various kinds of literatures, and when we speak also of Indian literature as a whole. I don't know how long it is going to be, but I feel it is big. So I will just end with one, just putting forward in sum without explaining the arguments for a single Indian literature and the arguments for a plural Indian literature or many Indian literatures. I will just make it very, very brief. So there are people who say there is something called Indian literature. Not many now, but there was a time when a literary historian like Sujit Mukherjee said that, Umashankar Joshi, the Gujarati literary historian, said that, and so did Shishir Kumar Das, and so did our own K. M. George. They all speak about Indian literature in the singular, and they have written histories of Indian literature. And then comes, of course, K. R. Srinivasa Iyengar, Krishna Kavalani, and so many others who wrote histories of Indian literature, almost like as if it was a singular literature. But so what is the argument against the plurality? One is that, well, you say you have different languages, and so you can have only different languages. But there are many who will argue that language is not the sole criterion of literature or literary criticism. Because we speak about black literature, about Dalit literature, about tribal literature, about feminist literature. Even in criticism we use structuralism and post-structuralism. That is where I have my doctorate. So various kinds of various ways of looking at literature. So there are so many ways, and language is only one of the many criteria. Not I'm going to contradict that very soon. That is one argument. There are many ways of looking at literature, not only based on language. And and there can be one literature in multiple languages as reflected in phrases like European literature. European literature is not in a single language, but you have so many. You have German, you have French, you have Italian, you have quite a few other languages when you speak about European literature. And this can be said also even about modern literature, like Canadian literature. You have a French Canadian literature and you have an English Canadian literature. So you can put languages together and call them by a single name. That is another argument for a single Indian literature. Again, there can be the very opposite also. There can be many literatures in under a single title, under a single name. When you speak about look at English literature. You speak about Indian English literature, American English literature, British English literature, Australian English literature. All these countries have English literatures. They are all written in English. So you can have many literature from many countries written in a single language, or you can have many literatures under a common kind of title. And then we have to also take into account multilingual writers. There are writers who write in 2 languages or even more. Our most familiar example, of course, is Kamala Das, who wrote poetry in English and short stories in Malayalam. And you have such people across India. You have Hiran Nagarkar, who writes in fiction in Marathi and also in English. And Vedha Mahatra, who writes poetry, who wrote poetry in Oriya and also in English. So all through the country, you can find people who write in more than one language. Like Padma, who writes in Gujarati and Urdu. Again, I can go on giving examples. Who write in 2, sometimes even 3 languages. So even a writer can be multilingual in that sense. And then you also say, for the sake of argument, that we have a common pattern of evolution for Indian literature. It began with tribal literature, then it came to the epic period, then we had a period dominated by Sanskrit, then we had the period of Bhakti literature, and then of course the literature of the freedom struggle and social reform, and after that we had contemporary, there is literature, progressive literature, modern literature, postmodern or post-modern literature, because I do not remember it till end, so I have begun to question all these, not only in my mind but also from public platforms. All these labels and titles, they are very convenient for all of you, for students, you need it. But ultimately, as a writer, I can hear Kabir's voice now speaking to me in India in this 21st century. So I cannot say Kabir is not a contemporary voice. Kabir is a contemporary voice for me, and this is true about Shakespeare. Speaking about Shakespeare that Bharat had presented. So Shakespeare speaks about me when Hamlet asked to be or not to be. It is not only Hamlet's question, it is a question of every one of us. There is no human being perhaps who has not at some period in his or her life asked to be or not to be. Should I continue or should I discontinue? Should I put an end to this life? Everybody comes to that kind of a critical point, a point of pain, a point of doubt, a point of impossible anguish, where when you begin to think, should I continue to live like this? Is it not a shameful life? Is it not a sad and painful life? So you go on asking, and so to be or not to be still echoes in your ear. Not only that, I am not quoting King Lear and other Macbeth and other. Everywhere you will find such not only quotes, many lines, many contexts which keep appearing in either individual lives or social lives. The thirst for power, for example, is a major theme in Shakespeare. In many of his plays, power is a major thing, as it happens in Macbeth and quite a few others. And love and suspicion is another theme, as it happens in Othello. So you can go on, taking examples from Shakespeare, and so all these characters keep on speaking to us. And so I was just questioning this. I began modern, postmodern, postmodern, and it is true. There may be differences of form, differences in which style is deployed, differences in which language is used, but ultimately all these people, ancients and moderns, classical writers and contemporary writers, are asking the same question, ultimately the same questions, like to be or not to be. What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of the huge universe? How long is Earth going to last? How long is human race going to last? Because these are questions which are extremely contemporary, and everybody is asking, every scientist is asking this question. Is Earth going to last forever? Is human being, because one of my own poems, I have written a poem called History, where I say, these animals and trees were witnesses to our arrival, our meaning human beings' arrival. Perhaps they may also be witnesses to our disappearance. We often forget this unity, this harmony, which you need to find between nature and human beings, animals, trees. I cry for morality. I might cry for the basic principles of life and society and politics and everything. And this is true about so many of the ancient texts. They were written in the past, but they continue to speak to us in the present, which is a completely different kind of present, because we are speaking in the time of AI, of which I think Prakash again you said. So, but even in the AI types, whatever AI creates, well, Valmiki speaks to me, Vyasa speaks to me, Homer speaks to me, Shakespeare speaks to me, well, and AI perhaps cannot, I cannot say that, be a Shakespeare or create a Shakespeare or a Homer or any of the major writers who have given us lessons which are everlasting, questions which are everlasting. Even if not answers, they have asked questions which we continue to ask. And that, so I was speaking about evolution, common patterns of evolution. So we have had, to some extent, I am also going to contradict all this, and then we have also common sonnets, common forms, like the Mahakavya or the Doha in Hindi, like Kabir's Dohas or couplets, or maybe you have Prabandha, you have Sandesh Kavya, you have Nataka, you have Prahasana, you have elegy, you have a narrative, various kinds of narratives. So we have certain common forms which all languages share. There are critical concepts which we share, maybe the ancient concept like Rasa and Dhwani and Vakrokti and that kind of conceptual framework, or maybe modern kinds of Western concepts and Western. Unfortunately, we tend to call all Western modern, which I think is not perhaps right. So we have also many Western concepts which have come to us, as I said about the structure, about the way language is used. You have everybody from Bakhtin to Derrida speaking about various ways of looking at writing. So and again people say, you will find that these movements are there, but they have worked very differently in different parts of India. Even the Bhakti movement, you have the Vaishnavite movement, you have the Shaivite movement, you have movements where Shakti is worshipped, and you have also very people who you can call secular in a very broad sense. So these movements have not worked in the same way. For example, we had progressive movement in Bengal, we had progressive movement in Kerala, we had progressive movement in Andhra Pradesh, but not in all the languages. So if you generalize it, you will find also certain exceptions. And this is also true about the evolution of literature. Only retrospectively we can call them a movement.
For example, the Bhakti poets were not aware that they were part of a movement. They were writing in, you had Tukaram, you had Sufis like Bulleh Shah, for example, and you had also writers from different languages writing in different ways. They did not know they were creating a Bhakti literature. We looked back and then we found they had something in common, and we decided to call it Bhakti movement. We decided to call otherwise all the Sufi poets we put together and called them Sufi poetry. We called some works epics. So all this happened later when we began to look back. Not that they were conscious of that they were part of a movement. And again about forms. Earlier I said forms are common, but just think about it. Are forms common? For example, in Tamil, there is a form called Chind. There is Hakavel, there is Venpa. Venpa is a didactic kind of poetry, something that teaches you certain principles of life. And you have quite a few others like Kalipa and Vanchipa and quite a few others which are confined to Tamil, basically Tamil forms alone. And you have also Kanni, or which is the word for a kind of couplet with a particular kind of rhythm in Tamil. And don't we have forms in Malayalam which are not there in any other Indian language? Yes, we have. Look at Nalacharitam. Do you have something called Attakatha, which is a form of literature and also a form of performance in other languages of India? There are forms which you can compare with that, You can compare it with other forms, but not exactly Attakatha. You don't have Thulal, Ottadulal, or Parayandulal, whatever, Chidagandulal. You don't have it in other languages. And I have often asked people, in Malayalam we often speak about Pattalakatha. We speak about Parapuratha and quite Agalevi and other people. We say they are Pattalakatha. So I have asked people from other languages, do you have a form called Pattalakatha or barrack stories, if we can call it so, stories from the barrack, stories from the soldiers? They said, no. We have some stories written in that background of war and soldiers, but we don't have a form like that. So, even if you look at Malayalam, you will find forms which are not there in many other languages of India. And this you can go apply to different kinds of languages, Bijak or Ramayani, which Kabir uses, or Rubai, Masnavi, Kavali, Kitta, Manakyub, or Nama, Kasida. These are all Urdu forms. They have come from the Persian and then used in Urdu. Even the Ghazal originally came from Persia, then came to Urdu, and now it is written in many other languages. So forms are not, as we think, common to all the languages. Many languages have certain specific forms, in addition to, of course, common forms which are there everywhere. And this is true about critical concepts. Concepts may be the same, maybe Rasa, maybe Dhwani, maybe Vakroti, or maybe the Western concepts, but we have interpreted it in different languages in different ways. Dhwani, for example, has 1,000 interpretations. So many people think they equate it with suggestion in English. It is suggestion. It suggests something. But some of the contemporary Western thinkers who have thought about the concept of Dhwani will say it is something that remains after you have completely read and even forgotten a work of literature. Something that remains, a reverberation, a kind of echo that remains in your mind. You have forgotten the poem, you have forgotten the lines, you have forgotten the play or whatever you have read, but then something from that remains in your mind, and it creates in you this kind of an echo, a reverberation of the concepts used, of the feelings expressed, of the various kinds of things that constitute literature, into which I cannot go now. I will later try to say what literature is, which is perhaps the first thing that we need to know. And again, if you look at the movements, I have already said movements were not in the same pattern all over. Works were different. Orientations were sometimes different. And if you look at epics also, it is not only Ramayana and the Mahabharata that are epic. In the northeast, there are epics which are they have very little to do with the Mahabharata and Ramayana. Many of them do not even know about it. They have their own epics in the tribal languages, and there are many other kinds of tribal epics which are sometimes only sung and performed, not often written like the epics that we have. So there are different myths, different Puranas, different gods and goddesses and legends. If you look at especially tribal people, they have their own ways of looking at life and looking at literature altogether. And if you look at the origin of languages, again you will find the same kind. I mean, they have originated at different periods. We are putting them all together and calling them Indian literature. But Tamil and Sanskrit must have originated. It's not very clear, but something like 3,000 years back at least, and Kannada around 1,500 years back, and Marathi and Malayalam around 800 years back, and Oriya about 500 years back, and what we call Indian English around 200 years or a little more back. So, and periodization of literature is also different. A particular period in one literature begins at a particular time, and in another literature the same must have originated much later. I often think of modern poetry. See, Marthekar, the great Marathi, the pioneer of modern poetry in Marathi, wrote in the late 40s and early 50s. While Ayyappa Panikkar and Kakkad and all those modernists began writing their major works like 1963 or whatever in the 60s, and it went on even into the 70s and 80s. So almost a difference of 2 or 3 decades in the origin of modern literature in different languages. And this is true about several other types of movements. So these need to be explained. I am not going into that. Again, influences. They are not simultaneous. Sometimes they come together. It is not that you are influenced by a particular kind of thing, literature at a particular period, but sometimes they, for example, English, look at English literature. Many of you are students of English literature. So to us, when it came to us, Shakespeare was there, it almost fell on our heads. There was Shakespeare, there was Victorian literature, there was romantic literature, there was modern literature, all this from Shakespeare to T.S. Eliot. All of them came to us almost together, almost at the same time. Not like what happened in Britain or in the US or any of the English-speaking countries, but sometimes the influences can come together, not necessarily alone, I mean one by one and at the same kind of time. And this is true also of influences, romantic influence, modern influence. You speak about the influence of Wordsworth or Byron or Shelley on the romantic poets, or the influence of Eliot and Jordan and other people on modern poets. But all of the influences came in at a different periods and in different degrees. Sometimes it was a heavy kind of influence. Sometimes there was a little. It was not a very strong kind of influence. And this is true about native histories. I spoke about literary histories, but even if you look at the literary histories of regions, you will find they are very, very different. Before as I said about Kerala, before the formation of linguistic states, we were all divided into so many states. Later they came together, and even when we came together, go to Kasaragod and try to speak Malayalam. Some of them at least will speak back to you in either Tulu or in Kannada. One of the first things I did, by the way, as the president of the Kerala Sahitya Academy, was to organize a multilingual meeting in Manchester. Many people questioned me. We have only one language, Malayalam, and the Kerala Sahitya Academy is meant for Malayalam. I said, no, this is not Malayalam Sahitya Academy, this is Kerala Sahitya Academy. Kerala has people speaking Tamil in Kanyakumari and here, and you have people speaking Tulu. We have a lot of people speaking Konkani. So we invited these people from different languages living within Kerala and then had a dialogue among them. So, and if this is the case of one state, you can imagine the state of the entire country, India. So many languages coexist, they keep on interacting. And there are traditions, there are sub-traditions, and they act at different points of time. Sometimes forgotten traditions come back, sometimes new traditions are created and born. So they also work not in the same way, not to the same degree, but sometimes very often together. And again, translation, the influence of translation. Again, it is very hard to define because several texts are translated at several points of time. Anybody who has read Homer or Virgil knows that these texts are being translated and retranslated and retranslated into English almost in every century. There are at least 2 translations of each of the works. Because for the contemporary readers, they create another kind of language to translate these ancient works. So translations too have their own kind of history. Each text has its own history of translation. And these translations influence original works also in very different kinds of ways. And this is true also about the concept of literature itself. Is it spoken literature, read literature, performed literature? These questions certainly remain because you have lots of performance. You have Kissa, for example, narrating a story, or you have others like Kirtan, like Dastangoi, which is telling a story in Arabic or Urdu, and you have Harikatha, Purakatha in Andhra, and all these. These are different forms of literature, and some exist only orally, some exist also on the written page. So what I want to say and conclude is that one single continuous history of Indian literature is impossible. You will have different histories, then you can start comparing, finding common influences, finding the differences and all that. So you cannot have, because these literatures have different kinds of orientations, and so you need to take into account this immense diversity when you speak about Indian literature and not speak about it as if it were singular. There was only one Indian literature. So we need, I conclude, inclusive histories, not something that keeps out something. Because if you want to write a single history, you may have to forget certain things which are there only, like Patalakada I said, which is there in one language only. But you need to have inclusive histories. You need to have oral, tribal and performed literature taken into account. You need to take into account periods of common influences and periods of differences. We have to take into account the similarities and also the diversity. You have to see literary history as a kind of space, as a kind of space where there is a network of relationships constantly working. There is a network of relationships and not a one-to-one relation, but many kinds of relationships are working at the same time. And so it becomes important that because Indian culture existed as a regional culture, even though now we speak of a single Indian culture, they existed as different kinds of regional cultures, and so we have regional forms, regional repositories of culture and literature, and each language has also different kinds of dialects, which become very important today, because in Malayalam a lot of poets are using dialects now. The fisherman's dialect and the Dalit dialect and tribal dialects are all come into contemporary Malayalam poetry. So taking into account that dialectal literature beyond formed standard languages also becomes important today. So we need to have a kind of aesthetic geography where we do not have eternal lines dividing one form from another or one region from another, but where we are trying to look at different histories of cultures and languages and trying to find what is common to them and what makes them different from the others. So we need literary histories which are in fact which influence one another and which also reflect the entire diversity of Indian literature, of histories of religions, races, regions, cultures. We need to take into account all these differences, and we need to help to hear the suppressed voices. It becomes important in any kind of democracy. For democracy, I constantly define as beginning to hear what we have not heard or what we did not care for earlier. Beginning to see people whom we did not even consider human beings. Take them, beginning to see means not just see them in the panchayat, in the municipality, in the parliament. See the transgender, see the woman, see the Dalit, see the tribal from the panchayat to the parliament. Then we can say, okay, at least democracy has begun to develop in India. Until then, well, we have a kind of formal democracy. You go to the polling booth every 5 years and all that. That is just a formal democracy. It is not democracy. Democracy is something that comes from below, comes from the people whose voices we had suppressed, people whose colors were hated, people whose lives were completely forgotten. Only then history becomes true history and democracy becomes complete democracy in itself. So we need to have a democratic comparative history of Indian literature, a comparative history, not a unified history, but a comparative history, looking at the differences, looking also at what is common to some of the literatures. And so and only then we can overcome this kind of a binary between difference and similarity. We look at it as complete opposites. But if you look at Indian life, Indian literature, you will find there are a lot of differences, and here and there are also poems which connect us. And a real literary history should take into account both the differences and the similarities, and create a kind of comparative history where we can see Indian literature as something varied, as a kind of varied landscape, and where we can also see here and there some things seem to be similar. To understand it that way, as I earlier said, dialectically rather than in a form of binary, that is extremely important when it comes to the history and of Indian literature and even Indian culture and Indian linguistic landscape. I can go on and stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Satchidanandan, for your very inspiring, thought-provoking, and enlightening lecture. We are very happy about it, and I know that your lecture calls for a 2-hour interaction. That is what we normally expect.
We can have a short one if you think it is
if we can allow some 2 or 3 questions, please come, because of the problem of the library people. Otherwise, we would sit here till 9:30. And so, please, a few questions, please.
Ask one question that these in South academic literature, generalized orders. Generalized orders. Let's go with literature. How we are having more than 3 or 4 Nobel laureates here.
Yeah, what I would like to
that generally Latin American literature, you may be knowing that, generally it is known as Latin American literature. A number of poem laureates are there, Nobel laureates. No, you haven't told that Indian literature as in general, different languages there, no doubt. But at the same time, we call it as Latin American literature. You admitted it or not? Yes. That is, I would like to have, you haven't referred to the anti-Brahmin movement organized by Ramaswamy Naikar in Tamil Nadu. You may be knowing, you might have heard that frontliner know that it could carry 100 years over that anti-Brahmin movement, that self-respect movement. And I would like to have some sort of these ideas about the Western literature. You have to refer to the Latin American or South American literature. I would like to get some more explanation in this regard. Thank you.
I won't go through another lecture on Latin American literature as most Malayalis who read the books know. I have translated quite a lot of because I was the first major translator of Pablo Neruda and quite a few others, or CESR Vallejo. And of course I have read all of Yosa, all of Marquez, and most of the major Latin American writers now and in the past. So I did make a reference to, not Latin because I was speaking about Indian literature. I did make a reference to other kinds of literature where you name a literature in the name of the country or the continent where it is born. I said Australian literature, Canadian literature, even when it is written in two languages, you call it Canadian because there is Canadian French literature also and English literature. You call it Canadian literature. And Australian literature, mostly written in English, again you call it Australian. So you can go by the geographic mapping of the world, follow the map of the world and name literatures following the name of the countries. There is no harm in that. In that sense, you can also speak about Indian literature as a literature that happens within India, which itself, as you very well know, is a recent concept and also even now a fluid concept. But anyway, it is there. You can call it Indian literature. But I was trying to say that it is not unproblematic. There are problems when you call it with a single name, because there are many languages, many literatures, many cultures, and we need to take that also into account when you speak about Indian literature. I'm not asking for a ban on the word Indian literature. As I said, I was the editor of a magazine called Indian Literature, and I can never ask anybody to ban that. But you need to understand that its content is somewhat complex and can also be controversial. It contains so many words. A single word that contains so many words. That's what Indian literature is, and that is what many other literatures known by the name of their countries also are. That's what I am trying to say. I'm not going to the Ramaswamy Naikar
A few more questions can be allowed, but before that, there's this very small 5 minutes function. And I invite our solid, one of our strongest leaders, I am repeating that word, Dr. K Satchidanandan, to tell you what.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. It's a sort of surprise, I should say. But we want all of you to be witness to that function. We know that CESR has turned 50, and at the same time, our distinguished guest, our Satchidanandan Maharshi, has turned 80. And we would like to celebrate it in a humble manner, but with pride. And that's why I told you that it's a surprise, because in fact he himself was not fully aware of what had been planned by the organizers. Although he might have had an he was special introduction. നമ്മൾ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയുന്ന പോലെ സാഗര ഗർജനം ഒക്കെ പറയുന്ന മാതിരി ഈ സാംസ്കാരിക ലോകത്തെ സാഗര ഗർജനമായിട്ട് ഇന്നും നമ്മളോടൊപ്പമുള്ള സച്ചിദാനന്ദ മാഷ് ക്രൈസ്റ്റ് കോളേജിൽ പഠിച്ച് ക്രൈസ്റ്റ് കോളേജിൽ അധ്യാപകനായി പിന്നീട് കേന്ദ്ര സാഹിത്യ അക്കാദമി സെക്രട്ടറി, ഇന്ത്യൻ ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന മാഗസീൻ്റെ ടീച്ചർ, ഒരുപാട് അവാർഡുകളൊക്കെ നേടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. പുരസ്കാരം, സാഹിത്യ അക്കാദമി പുരസ്കാരം എല്ലാം നേടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഇന്ത്യ പോളണ്ട് ഫ്രണ്ട്ഷിപ്പ് മെഡൽ അങ്ങനെ അത് കിട്ടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഡാൻറ്റെ അവാർഡ് അത് പറഞ്ഞു തുടങ്ങിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഞാനത് മലയാളത്തിലേക്ക് ആയത് നേരത്തെ ഈ പറഞ്ഞ മാതിരി തന്നെ അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ ഭാഷ മലയാളം ആയതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിന്റെ ആയിരുന്നു. Anyway, I request our dear friend Professor Shanmudas to offer him our memento, I should say, our birthday gift to our Satchidananda Maharshi, who proposed to be known as, or to be called Satchidananda Maharshi instead of anything else. So please, I request Shanmudas